Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this splendid Montana afternoon. It's great to see some of you coming inside on such a beautiful day. Thanks for joining us on this special occasion, the George M. Dennison Symposium on the Future of Higher Education. My name is Royce Engstrom. I have the pleasure of serving as the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs here at the University of Montana. It is indeed a rare occasion in higher education when we're able to celebrate a 20-year presidency of a single institution. That opportunity gives us reason not only to celebrate, but to spend time reflecting upon the future role of higher education in our state and in our nation and in our world. The demands and expectations on our colleges and universities are different in many significant ways than they were when President Dennison began his work here in 1990. The role and the capabilities of Montana's universities have certainly evolved in that time, and they will certainly evolve in the next 20 years. The idea for today's symposium came from a discussion with Regents Professors. Those are professors on our campus who have reached the highest level of distinction, two of whom are here on the platform, and I will get to introductions here in a few moments. But I have the distinct pleasure of about once a month having lunch with the Regents Professors. Shortly after George announced his retirement, I met with the Regents Professors and said, what would be a fitting way to celebrate this retirement? And the Regents Professors said, well, of course, it has to be an academic event, something focusing on a scholarly endeavor that is important to President Dennison, something that he is especially knowledgeable about. Well, but what better topic than higher education itself, a topic about which George is passionate and is certainly among the most knowledgeable in the nation, given that it has been his profession for more than 40 years. However, this symposium is not intended to be a retrospective of George's presidency, but rather a forward-looking examination of our responsibilities, our challenges, and opportunities. I'll introduce the guests here in just one moment. Before I do that, I would like to acknowledge the work of our signers, Amy Davis and Bonnie Christensen. Would you join me in giving them a hand for their good work? So we have an illustrious group on the stage today, and I'm appreciative of their enthusiastic and immediate response to our invitation to join us. It's our good fortune to have every one of them bringing their wisdom and their perspective forward on this occasion. I'll introduce each of them, and then I'll say just a word about our format that we'll use this afternoon. So I'll begin with our honoree, who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him a brief one anyway. As most of you know, George came to UM for the second time in 1990 to become our president. His first time at the university was as a student, when he earned his bachelor's and his master's degrees in history here, after getting his start in higher education over at Miles Community College. He studied at the University of Washington, obtaining his PhD in history in 1967. His career took him to the University of Arkansas, Colorado State University, and Western Michigan University before returning to UM. His legacy as president is going to be immense. Let me just highlight a few of the things that he will be remembered for. Transforming the university into a serious graduate research institution with a national reputation. The merging of 4 campuses in western Montana into a single university unit. Bringing international education and service learning to the university and helping to lead those efforts at the national level. Growing the faculty in size, diversity, and quality. Overseeing the growth of nationally competitive Grizzly athletics, dramatically upgrading the campus's physical facilities, most importantly of all, insisting upon the highest level of excellence and quality in every aspect of the university. He has been joined in his work these last 20 years, and certainly before that, by his wife, Jane Dennison, who has been just as much a part of this institution. So at this time, I would like both Jane and George to stand and receive our recognition. Thank you so much. We're delighted to have some long-time colleagues of President Dennison's here with us today, and some new colleagues as well here, and so let me introduce them. E. Gordon Gee is the president of The Ohio State University, remarkably for the second time. In his third year of his current appointment, he also served there as president from 1990 to 1997. He has been the chancellor of Vanderbilt University and president at Brown University, the University of Colorado, and West Virginia University. He has connections to the western United States, being born and raised in Vernal, Utah, receiving his undergraduate degree in history from the University of Utah. He received his JD and his EDD degrees from Columbia University. He spent time as a staff assistant to the U.S. Supreme Court and worked for Chief Justice Warren Burger. And he was telling us some remarkable stories about that work when we were having lunch a few minutes ago. President Gee is among the most highly regarded university presidents in this nation, and we are so fortunate to have him with us today. Please welcome President Gordon Gee. Gordon Gee, stand, please. M. Peter Mcgraw is the Senior Presidential Advisor of the College Board. That's the national organization behind the SAT exam and the Advanced Placement Program. Peter served for 13 years as president of the National Association of State Universities and Land-Grant Colleges, an organization which was recently renamed to the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. In that position, he was a visible and respected voice for public higher education nationally and internationally. He was appointed to that position in part because of his outstanding work as president of the University of Missouri System, president of the University of Minnesota, SUNY Binghamton, and most recently as interim president at West Virginia University. His degrees are in political science, with a bachelor's degree from the University of New Hampshire and his PhD from Cornell University. He and George have something in common, and that is knowledge about the Boer War. And they may be the only two in the room that are really knowledgeable about the Boer War. So would you please welcome Peter Mcgraw. Peter. On my left, Sheila Stearns is familiar to all of us as the Commissioner of Higher Education for the Montana University System. She's been leading the system since 2003, working to improve access to Montana citizens and increase the accountability and public trust in Montana public higher education. She was a vice president at this institution and then was chancellor at University of Montana Western and then president of Wayne State College in Nebraska before returning to take the position as commissioner. She and her husband Hal, who is I think somewhere in the room, are regulars at all kinds of events here at the University of Montana. Sheila has been a wonderful colleague in advancing the mission of this university and all of the other universities in the state. Please welcome Sheila Stearns. Waded Cruzado is a recent and welcome addition to the Montana higher education system. She is the new president at Montana State Universities, and she has been there for just over 4 months. She came to us from New Mexico State University, where she served as interim president, provost, and executive vice president, and dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. At New Mexico State University, she was instrumental in advancing accomplishments in sustainability, record enrollments, accreditation, and advancing women in science. Her own background is in linguistics, and she received her education in Puerto Rico. It is a delight to have Waded here with us in Montana and here today. Waded. Albert Borgman is one of the University of Montana's distinguished group of Regents Professors, having served this institution since 1970. He is a professor in the Department of Philosophy, where he teaches and conducts scholarship in the philosophy of society and culture, with particular emphasis on the role of technology. He's known as a staunch advocate for rigorous academic thought and high expectations. Professor Borgman has published a wide range of influential books and articles, He has a MA in literature from the University of Illinois and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Munich. Albert, thank you for being here today. And Paul Lauren is the University of Montana's first Regents Professor. He's a professor of history, where his teaching and scholarship focuses on the area of human rights. His work has earned him an international reputation, and he has been called upon extensively to lecture and advise various groups around the world. Recently, he has become a featured lecturer for the Teaching Company, producing a marvelous series of accessible lectures on the rights of man, great thinkers and great movements. Professor Lauren was the founding director for the Marine and Mike Mansfield Center on this campus. His own education is focused, of course, in history, with degrees from Washington State University and Stanford University. Please welcome Paul Lauren. We will begin our program now by hearing from Gordon Gee and Peter Mcgraw. They are going to do a sort of a tag team act up here, talking about a variety of issues that they see important to the upcoming time in higher education. After they speak, we'll ask President Dennison to come up, make some comments, and then we'll ask each of our panelists to make a few comments as well. And if you have questions along the way, if it's a burning question, go ahead and get our attention and we'll try to address that. Otherwise, we'll reserve some minutes at the end of the program for questions and comments from you. And then we will adjourn pretty promptly at 4 o'clock because we have some folks who need to catch an airplane. But I do want to make sure to invite you all to the reception then over in the ballroom of the University Center after this program. Thank you again for coming. Gordon, Peter, welcome to the podium.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Is this on? Okay, great. I'm sorry you wouldn't have missed much anyway, but I am...
I sure hope you're on, Gordon.
I'm delighted to be here with all of you. Let me just say a couple of things. First of all, Dr. Mcgraw and I are very, very close friends, so if you hear us engaging in rather casual conversation, we have had these conversations for low on 30 years in a variety of venues, and it's a real privilege, I think, for the two of us to be here. I can assure you that we did this both for our great respect for Dr. Dennison, for this institution, and the opportunity we had to talk about higher education, something that we spend a great deal of time thinking about, but more importantly, something that we spend a great deal of time doing. And I just want to comment on Dr. Dennison. I've known him for many, 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 many years. That's many. And I first knew George when I was president of the University of Colorado, and he was at Colorado State University. We did a number of things there together, good things. We both left, and that went to hell in a handbasket. But I've always been reminded about George, and I see this again here with him. George looks like a university president, unlike the two of us. But you know, my idea of a university president was always a tall, gray-haired, gravelly voice, very distinguished-looking person. And of course, I'm very disappointed every morning when I look in the mirror. But I am reminded of this, George, because I thought I was looking out on that great oval. You call it the Oval. And I'm reminded that when I came back to Ohio State the second time, as you heard, George has been a university president and has been able to hold a job at one institution. I've had 4 jobs while you've been here, and I escaped each time. But I came back to Ohio State. I started my job just when the freshmen were coming onto campus, and I was walking across the great oval of the Ohio State University. And as you know, Ohio State is a very large institution with some 63,000 students. And so I saw these 2 young freshmen walking along, and they were doing this wonderful thing, just chatting and talking with each other. And all of a sudden, one of them looked at me, and her face lit up. She recognized me. I thought, how wonderful. I've only been here for about 2.5 minutes, and she recognized me, and so I was going to be really cool, so I kind of nodded to her, and I nodded to her friend, and I didn't stop and talk with him, and she got beyond me about 15 yards, and I heard her say in the loudest whisper I've ever heard. She said, "Sue," she said, "wasn't that Orville Redenbacher?" George, they would never mistake you for Orville Redenbacher. I shouldn't do this, but this is much more fun than talking about serious things anyway. And besides, Peter will get to the serious things. I was telling the story today that I was in the O'Hare airport not long ago, and I'm running through the airport. This woman stops me, grabs hold of my arm. She says, "I want your autograph." I said, "Well, how wonderful." And so I sat down, wrote my autograph, so I signed E. Gordon Gee, and she looked at it, she said, "Gordon Gee," and she said, "Who in hell's sake are you? I thought you were Lou Holtz." So, anyway, we have serious business, but we want you to know, even in Montana, that it's great to be here. And I do admire this institution. I watched it from afar, and I think that I think the opportunity for us to be here. And what Peter and I are going to do, we have a series of questions that we have worked out together, and we're going to go back and forth. And the first question that we've kind of asked each other is, what has been the changed environment for higher education since 1990, since George assumed the presidency at the University of Montana? And my comment is the fact that the world is upside down. For many years, our higher education has been in a very privileged position in many ways, although one would not necessarily see it from our state funding. When I became president of Ohio State the first time around, about 30% of our funding came from the state of Ohio. It's now about 13%. Our budget is $5 billion, so you can tell that I did a wonderful job of advocating for the university. But nonetheless, it was a fairly regular way that we dealt with universities. We would have faculty, we would have staff, we'd have the knowledge base, we would be in the world of ideas. But as you know, we're now in a very, very fast-forward world, and I think that the changes are paramount. I just was mentioning this morning. I Twitter now. I'm on Twitter and I tweet. I guess that's what they call it. And I tweeted all of the people following me, and we had a flash mob at the Ohio Union the other day, which is now the number one YouTube video, and so the way that you can communicate, but also the way that the world has changed in terms of knowledge being driven. I would say that we have extraordinary challenges, but extraordinary opportunities. I would just add this last point, and that is the fact that I think that, given the economic crisis that we have faced over the last several years, that this may be the greatest opportunity for leadership of universities in this country. Not only the leadership of universities in order to change themselves in order to lead, but also the opportunity for universities in a very discreet way to take a leadership role in which obviously the political forces and others are not taking that leadership role. Mr. President?
Before I start, Gordon, it's okay for you to make comments that George really does look like a president and that you don't, but speak for yourself, okay, in terms of me. And by the way, I don't tweet and I don't Twitter, and I will leave the planet never having done a PowerPoint presentation, but I like a mic. And one more comment. I am here for the same reason that Gordon is here. My personal respect for the incredibly great work that George and Jane have done for this university, my respect for the University of Montana. It is an honor to be here. And if you want to learn, and it's not a bore, if you want to learn about the Door War, you come and talk to George and myself. Now, Gordon's absolutely right. The world of higher education and the financing and the struggles that we face are significantly, indeed, upside down, Gordon, radically different than they were in 1990. And this is a very smart and sophisticated audience, and you already know this, but just to emphasize the point, the amount of support that is invested in our public universities, and that's my passion, and I'm certainly not against the private universities. They're important. They have a role. But the action's really with the public sector and the public universities. State support, the trend line has been going on, George and Gordon and others for 20, 30 years. It's absolutely clear it's not going back to the way it was. It's a declining share. And so, yes, what the state government can provide to the University of Montana and to Montana State and in all the other states is still important, and you have to work your fanny off to get as much as you can. But the solution is not there. The solutions are going to have to be, and it's a tough issue, in terms of fees and tuition. It has to be in entrepreneurial projects and collaborations of all kinds with business and civic associations and other universities, private, public, international. We have to generate sources of income that will make up for the erosion of state support. And yes, we can fight like heck, and we do fight, in terms of EPSCoR for the University of Montana, and where I was recently at West Virginia University, for public federal support. But there is no magic bullet. It is a tough challenge. I'll give you one more example. I was having a conversation a few days ago with the chancellor of the humongous State University of New York system, Nancy Zimpher, who Gordon knows very well because she was recently at the University of Cincinnati. 64 units, and she was telling me that in terms of her obligations, yes, she has to spend time in Albany and try to work to get state appropriation, but she said, that's simply not my priority anymore. I'll let somebody else do most of that. I've got to work on private fundraising, on entrepreneurial relationships, all kinds of new collaborations. That's the only way that we can generate the revenue stream that's needed for this great State University of New York system. And I think that lesson, and it plays out a little bit different in different states and environments, I think that's true for the University of Montana and Montana State and the state of Montana, as it's clearly true for some of the things that, Gordon, you're doing at the Ohio State University.
I think that we're talking a little bit about the tough financial times. I think that I don't like to look at them that way. I like to look at them as opportunities. I was with a group of my colleague presidents the other day, and the stilettos came out when I said that, gee, I think that perhaps this time is the greatest opportunity ever given to a university president or a university leader, and that is the fact that, as we all know this, and I will turn here to my colleagues on the left, and that is that when the times are seemingly good, and there's enough money to go around, a little bit like marmalade, then no one wants to make a decision. Universities are very good at saying yes and maybe. They're horrible at saying no, and they're horrible at differentiating and distorting what they do. And I believe the challenge and the opportunity right now is the fact that we all realize that we are in the middle of a serious economic issues, and indeed, my view is the fact, and Peter may disagree with this, but I do not believe that this is a recession. I joke about the fact that every time I've changed jobs, we've gone into a recession, and so I do not intend on changing jobs anytime soon. But saying that, I think that it is a fundamental resetting of the American economic system, both social and cultural, intellectually and economically, and I believe that that is a great gift to the American university. But it also is going to require us to now differentiate ourselves. And we have a system head right here. No longer can you think about institutions being alike. You have to think about how they're going to differentiate themselves in terms of their roles and their opportunities. So indeed, the challenges going forward are going to require us to be very entrepreneurial, very graceful, that we're going to have to think differently. I was saying to my colleagues last evening, Ohio State, this massive institution that I am now part of, I describe it as an elephant. But it cannot remain an elephant. It's going to. My goal is for it to become a ballerina, not an elephant with a tutu, but a ballerina, and that means we're going to have to be swift. We're going to have to be agile. We're going to have to work with everyone. We're going to have to be able to think of the world differently. Because any institution that believes that it can hunker down, go into hiding. Go below the radar screen, that institution will not survive in long term. You'll either become a ballerina or you're going to become a dinosaur, and I do not intend on that happening, at least on my watch.
Well, Gordon, about challenges, I once took a university presidency, and I was asked by a reporter, why did you take this job? Aside from the fact that I wanted to earn a living, but my answer was I like challenges, and a very astute faculty member commented the next day, said, if this guy loves challenges, he's going to be euphoric. And we have a lot of reason for euphoria because we have huge challenges. However, and I do agree, Gordon, with the point you're making, they can be met, they will be met, because we have in our public serving universities a ethos and a mission of serving the public. It is absolutely critical to the social and economic development of our nation, our individual state and communities, and indeed beyond that, the world. And that mantra has to be with us. How we do this is difficult and challenging, and that's why we had a little conversation last night. I believe we need multiple sources of revenue so that we're not totally dependent on just one. It's not easy, but it can be done. And I do believe, and there are people who say that if a lot of your resources come from private donors, from entrepreneurial relationships, from all kinds of other activities, and you're not really fundamentally or overwhelmingly subsidized by your state government, you will lose your public mission. I don't believe that. I think we can and must maintain the public mission because that's what we're about. And the source of funding is important, but it's not ultimately relevant. And Gordon, one thing I'd like to comment on and get you to talk about a few of the many things you're doing at Ohio State is in terms of entrepreneurial relationships and collaborations between universities, not just obviously here in Montana, but some of the things that you're looking at and are doing at Ohio State that are in the entrepreneurial vein as one of the many things you're pursuing.
Well, I think that I think that if you think about, if you focus on this issue, for many years the mantra in the university has always been publish or perish, if you think about that. Yeah. I think the new mantra of the new university needs to be partner or perish. Yeah. Because I believe that unless we partner within the institution. Let me just start within the institution, because I believe that this will get everyone up out of their seats. Universities in this country are organized the wrong way. They're organized vertically. They should be organized horizontally. Yeah. If I were king for a day, I would get rid of departments and colleges, and I'd create working group centers, institutes, ways for us to organize ourselves around ideas. Because what do we do as a university? We produce ideas. We do not produce administrative structures. And we have become so embedded, so arrogant, and so isolated because of those structures that we are not both entrepreneurial and partnering. And it's with everyone. The great research universities in this country could not smell community colleges for many years. The most important institution in America is not, and I've been president of a number of those by the world's view, but is not Brown, is not Vanderbilt, is not Ohio State, is not Colorado. The most important institution in this country, in my view, are the community colleges, because those are the front doors to the American dream. They make it possible for our democracy to not only survive but to thrive. And universities who are not aggressively functioning in relationship to their community colleges will surely not be doing what they should be doing. And also with business and industry, for so many years my colleagues would say, you can't do this because business will tell you what to do, or industry will tell you what to do. Well, you know, universities have a way to protect themselves, but more importantly, we can no longer go it alone in terms of sustaining our research agenda and our idea generation. If we do so, we will become quickly a third-rate, if not a third-world country. I think about this at Ohio State. We had two projects. One is with the community colleges. That we created the first in the country through the College Board. Thank you, Peter. Of this program of a pathway to medical school. Why can you not identify folks in the community colleges who will be able to come and do great work in our medical schools and identify them early and have those pathways available? It's been very successful in a short period of time. On the Ohio State campus, when I was there the first time, is this nation's largest private research organization called Battelle. Battelle right now does 80% of the basic research in energy in this country. Think about that. They run Oak Ridge, they run Lawrence Livermore, they do all of this. Ohio State and Battelle were neighbors on the same campus. We couldn't even spell each other's name. And the net result, of course, was the fact that we both lost great opportunities. Since returning, we've appointed a joint vice president. We have put in a number of research grants together. We are doing things which alone we could not do, which together, because of science and opportunity, have made an enormous difference. One of the things we did, we created a STEM school. Between the two of us. Our STEM school, called the Metro School, was just designated by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as the best STEM school in the country, done because of partnerships. We have to move in that direction. Otherwise, we will not be successful as institutions.
Yeah, that's. I'm going to repeat what Gordon said. It is partner or perish. And on the comment about, you know, my quip, and it's not unique with me, is yes, we're organized in our universities with departments, and there is a reason for that, and it can work, and it can be made to work. But the world is not organized in departments. there are issues and problems and challenges like crime and poverty and energy and racial misunderstandings, indeed tensions and wars and conflict and illness and terrorism, and you can go on and on. The world has problems and opportunities and challenges. And I think that one of the critical responsibilities of professors and faculty and deans and provost types and university president types is to work on making sure that our structures, which are not the way we would probably design them if we were starting from scratch, and that's not an option, have to be multi and interdisciplinary. I can remember a long time ago when I was even younger than I am now at Brown University, Gordon, and there was a professor who was an incredibly brilliant professor. I don't remember what his discipline was. Maybe he was a physicist, but he got to be a generalist, and he cared about education and philosophy and history and everything else. And most of the faculty, I was not one of them who felt this way, thought this guy was a certified nut because they didn't know what to do with him. So they named him a university professor, and he was a distinguished individual, but he had no home, no department. And today, this guy's name, I think it was George Morgan, I remember his name. I mean, I think that's kind of the model of the kind of professors and faculty and students and thinkers that we have, because we need to be multi and interdisciplinary, and by the way, that will help in the partnering relationships that are absolutely essential to win. And here's my point, Gordon and ladies and gentlemen. If we want the support we need, not for the sake of the University of Montana or Montana State or whatever, but for the sake of the work we do, then we have to generate public support and confidence of all kinds, yes, from governors, state legislatures, business, civic groups, anything that you can mention, wealthy donors, that we are doing stuff that is relevant and important to the needs of the society, to improve the society, and for economic development. And I make no apology for arguing that one of the fundamental missions of American universities, and indeed public universities, is economic development.
Yeah, Peter, when he was the president of Selgic, came up with a brilliant idea to go to the Kellogg Foundation and have them finance a study on the future of the public and land-grant university. The Kellogg Commission, probably to this day, and George, I think you'd agree with this, is the most significant report issued on higher education, particularly on the public university, and has had long legs. And in fact, we're just celebrating the 10th anniversary. We need to do a little bit of celebration. But out of there, and I had the privilege of chairing that. You know, I mean, it is the way that it is sometimes. But anyway. Out of that came this whole notion of engagement, which was really a new term that we came up with, but it really was returning to the first principles of the land-grant institution. But although the University of Montana is not the traditional land-grant institution, it is an engaged institution and must be.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about. It's not simply about the land-grant institutions providing the kind of service to the people of the state. It's about every institution becoming fully engaged with their communities. The role of every institution in this state and through its leadership should be to make certain that these universities are embedded in the hearts and minds of every Montanan as the most important economic, social, cultural asset that they have, and that they will support it no matter what the world is outside. And the only way you can do that is by becoming engaged. The days of the isolated university in which you could sit around and talk with each other and enjoy each other's company and not have any activity that extends beyond the campus, those days, I think, are clearly gone. And if they're not, they should be gone, because of the fact that the role of university is to create ideas, but it's not simply to create ideas and sit on it. The role is now to change the world through those ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to make one further comment on the concept of the reality of the engaged institution, the engaged university, and it doesn't matter whether it's a land grant or a great state university such as University of Montana, engagement is partnership. It's not we smart, brilliant people from the university are here to tell you what you need and what you need to do and how to do it. It's partnership. We want to engage as partners with business, with community, with civic organizations, with government, municipal, state, agencies, whatever, in partners, because guess what? Maybe we can learn, and indeed we will learn from you, as well as maybe we have something useful to offer to you that will help us all. That's the concept of real engagement and real partnership. Gordon, let me just shift just a little bit to the issue, because we have discussed this at lunch, of international involvements. I'll make a comment and then ask you to go further. In my view, a university that is not internationally engaged and internationally involved in all kinds of partners, and it's got to set priorities, can't do everything. It's not a university if it's not internationally engaged. We are in a totally globalized environment, whether one likes that term or not. That's the reality. And a university, it doesn't matter where it is, has to be internationally involved in ways that are appropriate to its mission and its core strengths. And I wonder if you'd comment on some of the thoughts you have on this, because I know you're a big passionate on it as I am.
Yeah, I've stated since coming back to Ohio State that I've had two desires. One is requiring every student that comes to the university to have a passport, and starting in August, every freshman coming to the institution in order to be able to register will have to have a passport. I think it's the driver's license to the world, and it's necessary for us to become totally engaged in this very small planet that we have. The second thing I'd like to be able to do, by the way, Peter, is I'd like to be able to staple a green card to every international student's diploma, and make certain that they are able to last time I got anyone clapping anything I said was when I told the people of Brown.
Keep going, you may get another one.
Yeah, when I told the people of Brown I was leaving. But anyway, the issue is a very simple one. The world has gotten very, very small, and unless we're going to be fully engaged in the world in many different ways, it's going to be incredibly difficult for the institution. We need to have students come from far and wide to come and be part of our universities. We need to send folks out, but we need to even become more, to use our word, engaged. I was telling the folks at lunch today that we are starting a gateway project. We'll have 3 major gateways in which we'll be fully embedded in the country as a higher education institution. And we're choosing 3 out of many that we could choose because of the nature of our institution in China, in India, and in Brazil. And the purpose is to create very deep relationships, not only with institutions, but with the political structure and a variety of other opportunities, business elsewhere. Because that way, then our university, my university, our American universities, become international in clear ways beyond the kind of traditional study abroad approaches that we have to have. Clearly important for us to become fully internationally engaged in whatever manner as institutions, in order to be able to make a difference.
And that leads me to a point, whether you're talking about international engagement, partnerships, and the things we've been commenting on. I am a great believer in presidential leadership. I really think that university president types and the people they work with are absolutely critical to moving forward on the various agendas that we're talking about. And that's not an argument against the leadership and the creativity that bubbles up, to use a cliche, from within the university. At times, from staff, and certainly from students, but most typically and obviously from faculty, and particularly, generally speaking, senior faculty are very... And leadership is not just a one-way street, it's a multi-level street. But leadership is critical, and the job of a university president is to lead and put out things and make tough decisions, and you get criticized. It's really nice yesterday flying out to Missoula on the flight from D.C. to Minneapolis, St. Paul. I was sitting next to a lady, and I don't know, she asked me, started talking with me. I mentioned I was going to Missoula, and she said, why? And she was actually going to Arizona, but she really loves Montana, and she has roots here. And I said, I'm going to the University of Montana as a tribute going for the president. Oh, you mean Dennison? I said, yes. She said, he was a great president. And George, she was a student even before you came here. So that's really, really important, obviously. The point is, and I think I know something about the biz, and it is a biz, a university president who doesn't do anything gets criticized, and rightly so. a university president who takes on tough challenges, maybe prudently, but takes them on and makes decisions, guess what? They will be criticized. I'd have cardiac arrest if George has never been criticized. If Gordon, yeah, he would too, okay. But that is the job. The job of a leader is to lead, not in an arrogant, not in a self-serving way, but without leadership, you cannot meet the opportunities, Gordon, and the challenges that our great universities are confronting and will confront for many, many years into the future.
Yeah, and Royce, I know our time is up, and so we're going to get off this stage.
Yeah.
Now you've got the two of us, but let me just make one point. First of all, I think the role of presidential leadership is very important. But one cannot be a great university president without a great faculty. One cannot be a great university president without great students, without that kind of unique mixture. You know, I get asked every once in a while, why don't you run the university like a business? And I say, yeah, we could run it like General Motors or like Eastern Airlines or a variety of other places. Universities are unique institutions in which there is a partnership, and there has to be a partnership. The greatness of the leadership of a university president is to understand the greatness of those with whom he works. I think the second thing, though, that I'd love to have had a chance more to talk about, maybe we will before the end of the day, and that is the leadership of the university. And that is in this time of small-minded discourse that is occurring in this nation, in a time in which we do not talk to each other, we only yell at each other, in which we are flummoxed from the left and from the right. The one important role of the great American university is going to be the safe place in which common discourse over common values, in which there are uncommon issues, will be dealt with. This is where we ought to be talking about immigration reform, where we ought to be talking about health reform. And in these hallowed walls will be the solutions. It will not occur from the outside, and we ought to talk about that again.
Yeah, I'm just going to make a quick comment on it. I absolutely, totally agree. I just also say that the old line about, physician heal thyself also applies. It bothers the hell out of me, frankly, when our universities, which ought to be promoting civil discourse and serious debate and understanding, themselves at times are extraordinarily intolerant when, ultra-conservative speakers and people come and they can't speak and they get shouted down. We don't send a good message when we don't make sure that everybody has a right to speak and the audience has a right to listen and to have dialogue. And we need to foster civil discourse, and I think we can, and we need to make sure that we're practicing it ourselves.
Thank you, Gordon and Peter. Let's have another round of applause for them. I want to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. This is not something you needed to do, but I think in light of the comment that you just heard, it probably is something that you were well advised to consider doing, because it's this kind of discourse that's going to make a difference over the long term. We're talking today about the future of higher education. I'm reminded as we think about that with regard to education, it was Dewey, I believe, who said that education isn't preparation for life, education is life itself. And you could tell from the comments that that's what it means to these two very informed and very experienced leaders in the national scene on higher education. The four commentators that follow here, my comments, will add to a rich dialogue and then prepare the way, I hope, for an exchange involving you all in the discussion. I have a few moments to add to the discussion. It's going to be hard to do. It's a considerable challenge to follow these two. I'm reminded of Gordon's comment about a year and a half ago to the ACE, I believe it was, when he said that he thought that the 21st century could be the century of the American Research University, if indeed the American Research University responded to the challenge. And Peter has been involved in this discussion as well, as you have heard from his leadership at the Self-Reliant. On the other hand, even though I don't have very long, those of you who know me know that I rarely miss an opportunity with an audience such as this to get on the platform and say a few words. So I will. As I think about the future of higher education in the United States, I become more and more convinced that the challenge of our time, my time and what you have, is to find ways to translate the historic social compact obliging one generation of Americans to assure the education of the next generation into terms relevant to the 21st century. The most recent statistics and studies that I've seen indicate that this passing generation now will probably be the first in the history of the country, at least since it became a country, less well educated than its parents. That's an amazing consideration. Think about that and think about what it means. And to echo again some of the comments that Peter and Gordon made, Bob Brunick's president of the University of Minnesota talks about what he calls the new normal, the conditions that will apply and within which higher education will have to operate over the course of the next 10, 20 years. And one doesn't need to recite all of the data about the crucial importance of a robust system of higher education in order to assure the quality of life in our communities that we want to have. But we frankly aren't going to return to the good old days. So maybe it's interdisciplinarity, maybe it's a number of new approaches such as that, which are going to be critical to allow us to go forward. The pressures undoubtedly are going to intensify and increase for what's called accountability, and for us to add value while educating more and more Americans. Because if we're going to reclaim, as the President has challenged us to reclaim, first in the world in the educational attainment of our citizenry, we're going to have to educate more as well as do something about those who go through both the K-12 system and colleges and universities. They go through, but they drop out along the way. And far too few of them get the degrees that are necessary. Success in this effort, seems to me, will demand that we as a people accept the imperative that Craig Barrett, former president of Intel, likes to use all of the time when he talks to graduation classes. It's a very simple statement that he says he found in a fortune cookie, the source of all wisdom. You cannot win unless you choose to compete. It's very simple, but also very relevant. So I want to speak briefly to that challenge, which I consider the challenge of our time. And I want to focus on 4 interrelated areas that we need to take action. And they are in the order that I'll talk about them: assessment and accountability, numbers, and finance. And we look both internally and externally when I talk about these. I think anyone who has been in higher education very long, and maybe K-12 for that matter, will understand that assessment and accountability are reverse sides of the same coin. We either do well what we're doing and persuade us and pay attention to what we're doing, or we won't be fully accountable for the resources that are made available to us. We in higher education, I would be the first to admit, have been very slow to really accept the imperative need for assessment. And I don't mean grading the students in your classes. I mean agreeing about what it means to be educated and really doing the assessment that's necessary to say that when they leave us, they do have those skills and insights that are necessary for success in the 21st century, in the increasingly globalized 21st century that you've already heard about. And if we don't do that, why should we expect that we can be accountable to those people or those policymakers who have to provide the resources that we will use? And if we don't succeed in demonstrating that we are indeed educating people for the 21st century by changing our curriculum, by paying attention to something other than seat time, but paying attention to competencies. We needn't expect that we're going to have the resources we need to educate the roughly 50 million more Americans that we will need to educate in order to catch up with the leading countries of the world. And I mean all degrees, two-year degrees, as well as the more advanced degrees. That's what it'll take, somewhere in that neighborhood. So we have all of those numbers to deal with. We are not going to be able to return to the old days. So how in the world are we going to do it? It will cost at least, best estimate I've seen, $50 billion a year in order to educate that number of people before 2020. Those considerations bring me then to the third item in my list of issues that we need action on, and that's finance. Over the course of the history of this country, we had a fairly good approach to financing public higher education, the states being the primary financiers. Everything is pretty much decided there. If you look back to late in the decade of the 70s, and then fast forward, even with the increases in the Pell Grant, the contribution of the federal government to public higher education or higher education has not gone much beyond 10%. If you take the research, it's considerably more. But talking about the education specifically, it's not much more than 10%. It's been pretty flat, given the growth. And what we have seen, though, as Gordon and Peter talked about, is the shifting that's occurred. Moving the cost from the state, states no longer able to afford it for various reasons, reasons with which I think most of us would agree. The rising cost of health care, the need for K-12 education, the need for infrastructure, the need for welfare, the need for prisons, all of those things. Those costs are going to continue as long as we don't educate our citizenry as well as we should be. They're going to get worse. But how are we going to solve this financing problem? I saw just recently in the most recent issue of the Presidency, it's the journal that's published by the ACE, where the president of the University of California, Mark Udolph, is talking about the feds picking up a larger piece of the cost. All of these various ways in which the feds really ought to step in and do this. The problem with that is, given what we have done in terms of bailing out all of these failed industries we talked about a moment ago, where are you going to get the money? Who in this state, who in this country is going to agree to revenue enhancers or taxes, to be blunt about it, to provide the money if we're not accountable, if we're not doing what we say we have been doing all along in the educational classrooms, but we're not really as clear as we ought to be about it. Well, I want to conclude by suggesting what might be an approach, but we've got to do the other things first. We have to implement assessment in a way that it's truly credible, and it can't be just the voluntary system that currently APLU has, because that's a numbers thing. That's like saying No Child Left Behind is a solution to the K-12 problem. It isn't. Competencies are what we're after, and that's what we should be after here. So we need to have an assessment program, and then we can demonstrate our accountability. And then we can talk about an approach to financing public higher education, which will move it into the 21st century. And I didn't invent this myself. I borrowed it from a man I think had some good insight into the future of higher education. He suggested it about 20 years too early. Many of you will remember about 20 years ago when Bill Bradley suggested something he called education self-reliant loans. This is when the peace dividend was supposed to be realized by the end of the Cold War. We didn't get the peace dividend, but we got the suggestion that Bradley outlined. It didn't go anywhere 20 years ago. I think it does respond to the challenge of a new financing approach. Because what do we do with our current approach? We expect young families to save money and pay for the college education of their children when they don't have any money. So why don't we fund it up front and then ask for, as Bradley said, ask for the recipients to pay it back over the lifetime of the wage premium that they'll all receive as a result of getting the education. That would be a response, it seems to me, to how to fund undergraduate education. What would it take? Well, it depends on what you think it would cost to educate a student, but let's say it's about $100,000 for every American under 35 to get a degree of some kind. That's probably an account of $300 to $400 billion, a minor amount in view of what we've given away in the last 2 years. And this has a guaranteed return. A guaranteed return. All you have to do is look, those of you from Montana, look at the results of the study we did recently of the impact of the University of Montana on the economy of Montana. It generates $441 million per year in additional income that wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the university. And that's after subtracting out all of the investments in the university by the state of Montana or by the residents of the state who come here and give us tuition. Take that all out. It generates that. And this is analyzed by looking at the 35,000 residents of Montana who are graduates of the University of Montana. It looks only at one institution. Think if we looked at all of the institutions. And think if you did that in Ohio State where you have 50,000 plus all of the other institutions in the state. And the last point is that these residents contribute over $200 million in tax income to the state of Montana that wouldn't be there if it isn't for the university. We have a good case. We can make that case. That will deal with undergraduate. I think if we created that fund as a revolving fund, we also relieve the states of the pressure, the economic pressure of having to pay for undergraduate education. It seems to me then states would be in a much better position to fund graduate education and research, which is the technology transfer economic development engine that higher education can provide. I don't mean to demean undergraduates. I just mean to say that this innovation ability that comes from graduate education and research is what makes the difference over time. So that's a proposal that was made 20 years ago. I think it can work. And I hope that the conditions are such today that people will begin to pay attention. We certainly do know, I think without question, that the financing system we've used in the past is irreparably broken, dysfunctional. We need a solution. Here is one idea. Let's try it. And I think if we try something like that, it will enable our society to translate that old social compact into terms that are relevant to the 21st century and allow us as well to do as Parrott thought we would. That is, we cannot win unless we choose to compete. And I hope you'll join me in trying to compete. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, Gordon, and George. Before we turn to the discussants, I want to ask you to begin thinking of questions, because as soon as we ask each of our four discussants to speak for a few minutes, and I'd like to turn to you to get your thoughts and questions for any of the folks up here. So start thinking of those and jot them down so you're ready when we get to that part of the program. So now, Commissioner Stearns, would you please lead us off?
Thank you very much, Provost Engstrom. As a point of personal privilege, I would like to recall that 20 years ago this fall, I helped organize a symposium in honor of the academic interests and the future of higher education because we had a new president. That president, of course, was George Dennison. I was not supposed to be the MC of that symposium, but Jack Mudd had a trial come up or something, and there I was. I will tell you, and it's kind of an inside joke for you Montanans, one of the things that's changed is that the carpet is maroon and silver. It's a little different. There are some changes over the years, quite a few changes. It, too, was a very special event. I remember talking about Montana being a small town with long streets, and we've thought about that many times since. Also, as a point of personal privilege, before I talk a little bit about challenges facing higher education and threading through it, if you will be something of my tribute to my friend and colleague, George Dennison. I would like to note, I can't believe there isn't anyone who doesn't know, it's almost on the M, I think in my honor, is that Hal's and my daughter Malin told me at noon that her contractions are 8 minutes apart across town. They may be closer together now. And as she and I spoke on the phone this morning, I'm not sure which one of us was sort of more excited. And I said, well, you know, I'm sure I'll be able to sort of be involved with everything. I can still do George's moratorium. I don't think it was Freudian, George. I'm just excited. All three of our distinguished keynote speakers today have touched upon the liberal tradition and the future of higher education. Liberal, of course, in the classic sense of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. My late father used to describe Renaissance men such as our keynote speakers today, and men such as George Dennison, with his highest compliment. He is a gentleman and a scholar. Thinking back, I puzzle now as to whether this rare and high compliment around the McDonald dinner table pertained in any way to the distaff side, in particular to me. Was it possible to be a lady and a scholar? And here sits Dr. Waded Cruzado, spectacular addition to Montana higher education, president of Montana State University. Of course, one can be a lady and a scholar and a leader. It is an interesting fact, and it affects our future, that women crossed the academic Rubicon in this country about the year that George Dennison became president. George, I don't think there was a cause and effect involved in your presidential leadership and the growing ascendancy of women in their numbers in institutions of higher learning among those who earn degrees, although not yet among those who assume presidencies of America's most respected universities, President Cruzado notwithstanding. The year that George Dennison became president, in 1990, was almost exactly the year that women surpassed men in earning bachelor's degrees. That trend has not abated, and it is not limited to the United States. In 2007, men comprised only 42% of those who earned bachelor's degrees. The only other brief point in America's history when men comprised that low of a percentage of college graduates was in the final year or two of World War II, when, of course, most of America's young men were at war, making themselves into the greatest generation. By now, even in the achievement of master's degrees, it is about 60% women each year to 40% men, rounded off. We do not know yet the impact of this phenomenon on the future of society, but it has to be deeply significant. In some ways, it is exhilarating that opportunities for women have clearly accelerated in recent decades. But it is also troubling when men and women, in proportions about equal to their demographic balance, are not participating proportionately in the human capital economy that has education in every part of its root and branch. My father, with his 4 daughters and 2 sons, would be pleased, but also worried about the future of the gentleman scholar, about the future of the educated leaders of our state and our country, with such a startling disparity, whether the trend favored either his sons or his daughters. President Dennison has made a hallmark of his presidency the commitment to the kind of engagement that President Guy was speaking of a moment ago. Service learning, civic engagement. It was a theme of that symposium on this stage 20 years ago. George has doggedly led others toward this mission, his commitment never wavering through his 20-year presidency. The scholar of my parents' idealism was not only a gentleman or a lady, he or she was also engaged in the civic discourse and community building of the villages and cities of our democracy. Let me give you a personally poignant example of civic engagement originating in higher education. Last Friday night at MSU's Honors Night, President Cruzado introduced me to an individual who was receiving an honorary doctorate from MSU. His name is Willis Wettstein, a civic engineer whose career has taken him throughout the country and to developing nations, building water projects on behalf of public health and healthier communities. As we conversed before dinner, I mentioned that I grew up in Glendive in eastern Montana. He responded that one of his first jobs out of MSU was as a project leader in Glendive, leading the construction of a new water treatment plant. So, fast backward 55 years. One of the searing memories of my childhood was my parents' outrage that their fellow Glendive citizens had voted down a bond issue for a new water treatment plant, even knowing that polio was endemic at the time and that one of America's most serious hepatitis outbreaks in the 1950s was in the little town of Glendive, Montana, and that it could be traced to a contaminated water supply. Just piping the water out of, at that time, the polluted Yellowstone River was making people sick, including children. So the other night, I told Mr. Wettstein, the now internationally respected MSU civic engineer, how my mother ran for the city council for that cause alone in about 1955 and was instrumental in the passage of the bond issue that resulted in the flow of fresh, clean water from our faucets. Mr. Wettstein said he loved Glendive so much his 2 years there that he almost stayed there. It's probably good that he went on to other endeavors. And this does relate to civic engagement, service learning, and higher education. Because my mother, as well as my father, were University of Minnesota graduates. Dr. Mcgraw, who served there as president for 10 years. They loved their alma mater, and they were empowered by it. Dr. Guy, they were loyal to the Big Ten, in theory. I even learned most of the Big Ten fight songs growing up. But the rivalry with Ohio State was on their mind each fall as various enemies marched toward the Rose Bowl. Enemies with puzzling names to a small child names such as Buckeyes, Wolverines, Badgers, and Boilermakers. Nothing as goofy, Peter, though, as Golden Gophers. We were all big fans of college athletics, and we are to this day. I juxtapose these thoughts with my parents' commitment to civic engagement because I think it is no accident that they absorbed a great deal of their sense of responsibility from their liberal education in a truly fine university that was full of intellectual ferment at the time, with classmates at Minnesota such as Hubert Humphrey and Eric Severide. Intellectual ferment. Is it a phrase still characteristic of the zeitgeist of our university or most universities? As Pell Institute scholar Tom Mortensen said recently about the phrase social justice, it is possibly and sadly anachronistic in many colleges. President Dennison has always understood that civic engagement, intellectual ferment, social justice, and leadership have to be part of a college education worthy of our democracy. I touched for a moment on intercollegiate athletics. I heard it might be mentioned today. Apparently, only me. But you won't be surprised to know that my parents admired coaches such as Joe Paterno, a gentleman and a scholar. As an administrator in higher education, I, as I'm sure others, have watched with dismay various presidencies rise and fall based on the demeanor of a head coach who, like some of our banks, is too big to fail. Indiana University and a brave president named Miles Brand come to mind. Dr. Brand did the right thing and did it well in Indiana, don't get me wrong. But my advice to new presidents is that if a coach shows signs of being a jerk, then we should not care who he or she is. If they are Woody Hayes or Bobby Knight, the president has to nip that in the bud. We should have as coaches and student success advisors only those who share our commitment to being kind people with inquiring minds interested in solving the world's problems. My final point for this symposium is that higher education has become far too dependent on the income of a child's family. This is a 21st century challenge. I believe it is a national scandal that a gifted student from a poor family is far less likely to earn a college degree than a low-achieving high school student from an affluent family. Some universities have given more than lip service to changing that within their admissions and financial aid policies. President Dennison's invention of MPACT in 2006 is a good example of his commitment to admission for worthy students regardless of income level. MPACT stands for Montana Partnering for Affordable College Tuition. He came up with this long before Montana's statewide college affordability plan. It was a typical, original, creative George Dennison initiative. It was the right thing to think up and to carry it out over the great concerns of his number crunchers. I conclude by saying it is a privilege to join a panel such as this in honor of a career such as that of President Dennison. He has been my colleague and friend for all of the past 20 years, and I dare say his like will not be seen again. As my father would have said about a man like George, he is a gentleman and a scholar.
Awesome.
Good afternoon. What a wonderful honor to be here in this very special moment, celebrating President George Dennison and celebrating higher education in Montana. Certainly a year ago, I did not envision myself in this wonderful place. And you know, George, 3,000 years ago, epic literature gave us a wonderful example in the Epic of Gilgamesh that talk about clashes of titans, of big battles. And what they told us is, and this was repeated again and again in every epic poem, that you would have confronted in a battle two monumental arch rivals of imposing characteristics. And they would compete, and they would challenge each other, and in the end, they would not defeat each other, but basically they would agree to collaborate. When I look at the history of this wonderful state of Montana and its two institutions, University of Montana and Montana State, it reminds me of that wonderful example of two monumental rivals that yet agree to collaborate and to do what's right for the sake of the people. 1990 was the year when my colleague, and it's with great trepidation that I say my colleague, President Dennison, started. That was the year when I graduated from my PhD. So, what we are seeing today at the state of Montana is a big rite of passage. It's a closure of an era, but it's also heralding of a brighter future, thanks to the many contributions of individuals like George Dennison. George has been a transformational agent, not only in education in Montana, but his legacy has certainly transcended the walls of this wonderful university, and he has a national presence. And in many ways, when I look back, George Dennison, the faculty of University of Montana, collaborating with the faculty of Montana State University and every campus in this wonderful state have built the platform that made my appointment possible, but more importantly, that has contributed to the advancement of so many citizens. And for that, I think that we just need to say, thank you, George Dennison, for your many contributions. You know, last January, as I started traveling around the state of Montana, getting to know it better, I ended up in Greece country. And people wanted to pose some difficult questions about the rivalry between Greece and Bobcats. And I tried to explain to people that every day one of our children, every day a Montanan decide to go to University of Montana or to Montana State University, that's a day when everybody wins. And it was interesting because I happened to be at one of our local companies in Kalispell, and I was walking around the company, and there were banners for Grizzlies and Bobcats. And I was talking to the manager at the end of it, and he said, he translated it in more eloquent ways when he said, there's only one day in the year when we do not root for both universities. So, talking about the future, it's always an invitation to talk about the past as well. You know, universities are wonderful institutions because they are home to dreamers and visionaries, to people who say things in new and different ways. And I always have to go back to the history of the establishment of land-grant universities. It was July the 2nd, 1862, when the U.S. Congress had what's perhaps one of the most inspired moments in U.S. history, when, thanks to a congressman from the state of Vermont by the name of Justin Morrill, Congress passed the law that established land-grant universities, that opened one university in each state of the Union for the purpose of educating the sons and daughters of the working class. Think about it. This nation was in the middle of a civil war. If we talk about challenges today, when we talk about financial tragedies, there's nothing comparable to having brother fighting brother, sister turning against sister. And yet, in that hour, Congress decided not to be limited by its immediate circumstances, but decided to envision a better and brighter future. And that's who we are today. We started as land-grant universities, but actually every public institution shares that same aspiration. That was almost 150 years ago when we started with 50 universities in this state, in this nation. Today, we have 104 universities that carry the name of land-grant universities. Had it not been for the establishment of land-grant universities or public universities, many people in the audience, certainly me, we would not have been able to attend college. I can tell you for one thing, my parents wouldn't have the means to send me to the East Coast or the West Coast to pay for a private university. And yet, I'm sure that when Mr. Morrill thought about the establishment of land-grant universities, my native Puerto Rico was very far away from his mind. Let me tell you what the land-grant university and what public universities did for Puerto Rico. We were one of the most poor countries in the Western Hemisphere. And it was thanks to the establishment of a land-grant university in 1911 that we started to prepare the professionals, the engineers, the scientists, the people who transformed the economic landscape of the island and the entire Caribbean basin. It's exactly the same story of what has happened in the state of Montana and University of Montana. So we just need to ask ourselves, when we confront ourselves with this situation, so where do we go from here? And I need to believe in dreams, and I need to believe that confronted with these challenges that we have within ourselves, the necessary creativity to stand up again and to do the right thing. As our panelists said this morning, as we look towards the future, our public universities will be very different. Actually, we can just see it right now. Our students are very different. Our students will be learning without the structures and the strictures when you and I went to school. It will be a university that will be engaged in many of the attributes that we just heard this morning or this afternoon. What's our role? Where's our partnering with K-12, with community colleges? What's going to be our relationship with distance education, with international education? It will be a university deeply committed to student success. Thankfully, gone are the days when you and I went to the classroom when the prevailing paradigm was the survival of the fittest. Remember? And we started 45 in each room and 11 of us would survive. Or remember the joke that some university presidents used to say on the first day in college when they would say, look to your right, look to your left. Those two would not graduate. Did you notice that it was always your neighbors who would not graduate? It will be a university where, as has been said before, it will serve as engine of economic development and economic growth. And hopefully, it will be a university where we'll be equally committed, as in the past, to solve and hopefully totally eradicate social disparities. So, this university in the future, where we just need to find the ways of breaking this iron triangle of cost and quality and access. We just cannot afford to go back in time to a time where we did not have public universities. We tried that once. We are not going back in time. So it behooves us to build that university of the future, the university that will be engaged, alert, relevant, provocative, responsive, and I would like to say, in the best sense of the word, seductive. A university that would allow us to fall in love with knowledge, starting with our children, culminating with our legislators and our alums and our benefactors and our friends. A university that will call us every day to be servant leaders, just as George has shown us how to be a servant leader. To remind ourselves that it's not about serving ourselves, but about serving others. And perhaps the best role of a university president in that university of the future will be not to command or to push, but to add focus. In the end, what I have found is the only thing I do as university president is to use the skills that I learned in the classroom. Remember when they used to tell us that good teachers teach, but great teachers inspire? The leaders of the university of the future will not only manage or lead, they will persuade. They will bring out the best of us. In the end, that's what education means, from the Latin educere, which means to bring out. Interestingly, it's the opposite of inducere, to push in. That's inspired leadership, that's servant leadership, that's what our faculty members do every day in the classroom, for the good of our citizens and for the children of our children. Thank you, George, for everything you have done for Montana.
It takes constant energy and ingenuity to keep universities a going concern, and faculty are often ignorant and not always appreciative of the efforts that it takes to keep them a going concern. Still, once the welfare of a university is secured, at least temporarily, we're still left with the question, what's the final responsibility that we have to society? Ours is a decent and prosperous society, and we have reason to be grateful for it being so, and a reason to be vigilant that it stays that way. But it's not a good society. It's not a society devoted to the pursuit of cultural and moral excellence. The elite here assembled is so devoted, but most Americans are physically unfit, ignorant of the world that they live in, and indifferent to the human misery and the environmental damage around the globe. And that brings me to the university. What is our role in all this? The university teaches means and ends. We educate the lawyers, the doctors, the accountants, the engineers, the teachers, and more, who keep the university and maintain it as a decent and prosperous university. We're doing a good job at that, and we are right in being proud of that achievement. But we also teach ends, those things and practices that constitute the completion and fulfillment of life. Fiction, poetry, music, dancing, jumping, leaping, throwing, playing, sculpting, painting, philosophy, and history. And there is an unfortunate discrepancy between our teaching of means and our teaching of ends. We teach the means confidently and with the encouragement of society, and they deeply inform the lives of society and of the students that we teach. The teaching of ends is tolerated by society, and we teach ends diffidently and defensively. And our students remember them ruefully if they remember them at all. So the task ahead of us, I think, is to have a conversation in higher education, how we can hope to teach not just the means, but also the ends of the good life in such a way that they begin to inform the lives of our students and society, and to make ours not just a decent, but also a good society. And one more thing. George Dennison made this university a beautiful place. What's all that beauty good for? Well, it's good for a lot of things. But important, it's also good in itself, a reminder that a university itself can be a place of completion and fulfillment, a little utopia, an obligation for all of us who work here, and a city upon a hill for the rest of the country. Thank you.
Five years ago, I got on the number 12 bus in the morning on my way down to the University of Montana, as I always do, and I had the occasion to sit with a graduate student from mathematics. He was very excited about a new handheld electronic device that he held in his hand. And he was just overwhelmed by all of the computations that he could produce on this with just a minimum of effort. And I tried to share some of his enthusiasm, and he was pleased about that. And he said, geez, I'm so interested that you're so excited about something having to do with mathematics. Have you ever had anything like this yourself? And I said, as a matter of fact, I did. It reminds me of how excited I was when I first picked up my first slide rule.
Thank you. And he said, in response, slide rule. Slide rule. I think I maybe saw one of those in a museum once. Well, this serves clearly as an example about why we need to focus on the question of change when we deal with the future of higher education. And all of the magnificent comments you've heard this afternoon address that particular point of change. I want to suggest that this challenge of change is essential as we look at the future of higher education, but I also want to suggest that it's insufficient. What I mean by that is this. When we focus on the future of higher education, I believe that we need to also address not just the challenge of change, but the challenge of continuity. That is, how to address what we have done well and what we need to continue to do in the face of change, in the face of new challenges, new developments, and also in the face of fads. In my judgment, we as a university have been at our best over a very long period of time when we do two particular things. The first of these has to do with the acquisition of knowledge and the development of perspective. That is, in the United States, we believe that all university students should be exposed to a variety of different disciplines. This is why we have general university requirements, and why most of these are taught at the core of the university, which is the College of Arts and Sciences. We expect our students to have some level of knowledge about and some perspective about writing, mathematics, with or without a slide rule, modern and classical languages, expressive arts, literary and artistic studies, obviously historical and cultural studies, social studies, an issue that I'm particularly proud about at the University of Montana, ethical and human values studies, including those of human rights, American and European perspectives, natural sciences, including at least one science class with a lab, and finally, indigenous and global or international studies or perspectives, one of the things that my colleague, Professor Kern, would call transnational competence. 20 years ago, I was contacted by members of the search committee who happened to be searching for a president of the University of Montana. They called me up and they said, listen, we'd like you to spend a couple hours with a man that we think might just have the abilities to lead the university. His name is George Dennison. And we'd like you to explore what he really feels about international education. We spent a wonderful several hours with each other, walked from my office across the Madison Street Bridge, and it was crystal clear to me that this was not something that he just checked off of a box because he wanted to be the president of the University of Montana. This man believed passionately in international education. And George, among the many other permanent legacies that you will leave to this institution, is clearly your commitment and passion toward understanding other people in the world, toward understanding international relations, and appreciating indigenous peoples, other customs, and those around the world in increasingly smaller and smaller planet Earth. The second thing that we historically have done, and have done well, is the development of capacity. That is, the capacity to appreciate the beauty and the richness of this knowledge and education and perspective that we try to teach our students. The capacity to reason, to be able to do not what to think, but rather how to think. The capacity to confront information, overwhelming amounts of evidence today, and opinions, and be able to confront them with discernment and good judgment. In addition, we want to try to develop the capacity to have our students become leaders and citizens, to fully engage in civic engagement, to be of service, to take the special privilege that we have at an institution like this and be able to use it not just for ourselves, but more importantly for others, especially those in need whose rights are being violated daily, those at home, those in our state, those in our country, and those around the world. This is service to others. We also want to develop the capacity to appreciate the change that you've heard about this afternoon. But also, I want to suggest the capacity to appreciate the value of continuity. We want our students to have the capacity to look back on their education, whether it's an undergraduate or graduate education, and be able to honestly say, this experience transformed my life. A transforming experience, as we've already heard from other speakers. 5 days ago, President Dennison and I took an individual to lunch. He's a former colleague of mine. His name is Jules Carlin. He is 96 years old. But more importantly, he was President Dennison's history professor. Right? The joy that I had in looking at the eyes between a former student and his professor and a former colleague of mine was a constant reminder to me about what it is that we as professors want to do to our students. We want it to be a life-transforming experience, and it certainly was for George Dennison. Moreover, we want to develop the capacity of students and all of those who enter here and who stay here and who leave here to understand that education is a lifelong process. And thereby to hope that the knowledge gained here will someday be transformed from knowledge into wisdom. When we can accomplish these, we not only remain faithful to what has been entrusted to us as this light on the hill from the past, but poised to contribute to our best to higher education in the future. And toward this end, George, I'd like to thank you for not only recognizing the past, but also the future that lies ahead for higher education and for the University of Montana. Thank you very much.
Thank you all a great deal. I've had the pleasure the last 24 hours of spending time with all of the individuals here in a nice, intimate setting in most cases, and it's been just a wonderful experience to be able to exchange ideas and hear the thoughts of people who have thought and spent so much time thinking deeply about the future of higher education. I think we added up last night among everybody here, there are about 80 years of experience as university president or college president. And I think we totaled up 300 and some years of experience in the business of higher education in one way or another. So it's been a rewarding day and a half. Let's turn now to you and see if there are questions that you'd want to address to anybody here or to everyone here. So let's see what you have out there in the way of questions. And you'll have to wave because I can't see very well. Okay, over here, Professor Wright.
So I'm a professor of computer science. Higher education is about communication between students and faculty, students and students. And the technology of communication is changing. You only have to look at Facebook and Twitter and mobile phones and smartphones to see that. So I think the challenge is how can we achieve the vision that Paul says about what higher education is through improved methods of communication and finding out assessment methods to measure whether that has been done. And some point or other, this hopefully will lead to an improved productivity of higher education. So I guess that's just a general comment.
Okay. Any response to that from our resident Twitterer up here, perhaps?
I agree. I agree. Thank you.
Chancellor Story.
Thank you, Royce. George, if you had 10 more years here, what 2 things or 3 things would you tackle? What would you take on?
I only have 10.
Take 20,
Well, I think there are 2 or 3 things that I would give more emphasis than I have. Now, one that I've had to emphasize simply because it's in the nature of the job is figuring out how to make it go, where to get the money to make it go. But from the first State of the University address I gave in 1990, I have been recommending that we should require at least a semester abroad of all of our graduates. We have not done that for lots of different reasons. Primarily, they are financial. How do you figure out how to get the students abroad? And most recently, the Lincoln Commission report gives us some hope that we might be able to do that over time. And we have an increasing number of our students who study abroad, but the life-changing experience of living in another culture is still not available to all of our students. So that one I would give a lot of attention to. And the second one is something that if you read through the State of the University addresses, there's a theme that runs all the way through, and it's the one I tried to mention briefly in shorthand. Let's talk about competencies. Let's define what those competencies are, and then let's have a mechanism by which we can indicate that these graduates, when they leave us, truly have them, no matter how much seat time they've had. Paul Lauren mentioned a moment ago Peter Kern's favorite, which is transcultural competence. We use those terms very loosely, but we don't really do the kind of assessment to indicate that our students leave us with the preparation for the 21st century. Those are the 2 I think I would give a lot of attention to if I had 20 more years.
Yes. Go ahead. Oh, Lori, okay.
I wanted to follow up on that question from anyone's perspective. How then would you negotiate with the high schools to jumpstart that development of competence in a more effective way?
I'm going to speak to that, and then I want my colleagues to speak to it as well. I think in the way that we are now beginning to focus on it, and it's something that Craig Barrett and Achieve has tried to focus on throughout the last few years at the national level. And that's by aligning our curricula and by also making certain that we are doing the assessments at the K-12 all the way through there from one phase to the next. And we really haven't done that. We're now recently engaged in that in the Missoula district, and we're engaged in that across the state. But I don't think as a society we've really come to grips with that. No Child Left Behind is hardly any way in which you can get to that issue, but our superintendent of schools here in the Missoula district makes the point that the transition from the elementary grades to the middle schools to the high school is exactly the same kind of problem we have to confront as we go from high school into the university. And I'm reminded of one salient point about how the universities really have regressed rather than progressed. When the University of Montana was established and the first students came in 1895, 45 of them went to the prep school. 5 went into college and university courses. And until the 1920s, the president of the University of Montana was the inspector of the public high schools. There was a mechanism by which we could keep things aligned. I think it's our fault that we stepped away from that, and it's time we step back to it. I don't think we'll solve the problem until we do.
Part of the issue, for me at least, is the fact that we have always thought in this country about there being Berlin Walls among our various institutional activities. We think about K through 12, and then we think about undergraduate, and then we think about graduate, and then we think about beyond. the reality in today's world is the fact that it's K through life, and that we have to really structure ourselves to understand that very clearly. And in so doing, I think that we look at a much more integrated approach. I like that term, transintegrative or transcultural. I'm going to steal that term, I can assure you. And I think that's important. The second thing is also we need to be very careful about these competencies, though, George, and that is the fact that I take a look, for example, at No Child Left Behind. I believe that it has been a tragedy in many ways, because what we have done is we have taught teachers to teach students how to take tests and not how to teach, or not how to learn how to think. And I think and so what we do is we find in many ways that our cultural competencies are going in the wrong direction. I happen to have a daughter who is the daughter of university presidents since age 4. I was able to send her to the best schools, able to get her Princeton access to Princeton reviews and so forth. Yeah, she performed very, very well. But this does not talk to those who do not have that fortunate set of circumstances. So we need to be very, very careful about how we translate that into competency.
This is a huge topic, and it's a great topic, and what George and Gordon have said, I totally agree with. One of the things that's always bugged me, with exceptions, notable exceptions, and at least 2 are sitting to my left right here, most American college and university presidents have never engaged themselves and paid any attention to elementary and secondary education. Many of them wouldn't know the name of the school superintendent in their state, much less even the school superintendent in their area, and we have failed miserably, and we are not aligned in terms of our so-called K-12 curriculums and what's taught with what's done in universities. And my rhetorical comment would be, and I use the term higher education, and it's fine, and I've used it this afternoon, and we all use it. I just wish to hell that we would just stop. Higher education implies is lower education. I wish we would just talk about education for men and women of all ages and circumstances, et cetera, and think about, as Gordon just said, K-L, kindergarten, indeed even pre-birth, but anyway, kindergarten through life. And we ought to just worry about education, and we need to integrate and engage and partner between our universities. And I think that is going on here at the University of Montana, and obviously it's going to go on and is going on, I'm sure, at Montana State. But that is a crying, essential need for our universities. It's all about education, not higher or lower or whatever. It's just about education. That's what we need.
Sheila?
And as one final comment on this, I think that Montana is really quite blessed. The Superintendent of Public Instruction, Denise Juneau, leading the charge with schools of promise across the state. But Montana's challenges as we try to align the Common Core standards, Denise's group, the group I belong to, are all meeting together more frequently now instead of, different cities, different times of the year, to align the kind of alignment, focus on identification of competencies. Because of the disagreements, Bobby Evans should smile at me about how different is it to be college ready versus career ready, or increasingly are those converging? And what it comes down to ultimately relates to something George hinted at, and that is expectations. The expectation that any child from kindergarten on has the entitlement to be a lifelong learner and not sort of shunted off into some future that does not enable them to have the kind of means and ends reflective education that Dr. Borgman spoke about. I do see, from my vantage point, some real hopeful signs on that horizon.
Is there one last question? Peter.
I was
very happy to hear George mention his first State of the University talk. I remember that very well. I remember how passionate you were at that time about the idea of having each student at the University of Montana have an international experience. And I'd like to ask a question of President Gee. I was very intrigued by your idea of having everyone have a passport when they come to Ohio State University. And my question is, there's 60-some thousand students at Ohio State. How do you envision them actually using the passport?
Hey, well, listen, one thing at a time. I haven't thought beyond the passport. No, the truth of the matter is that, first of all, I think it's both symbolic and substantive, and I think that that's very important. Secondly of all, we are working very hard on the upside of this to create programs, opportunities, activities in which our students can go abroad in a variety of ways. The traditional notion of a student going for 3 months on a shopping tour to Florence and say they've had an international experience is not good. I think that what we need to do is we need to rethink all of these. And sometimes you run into very serious problems. For example, with ABET, who accredits engineering, they say, well, you know, you have to crowd 5 years into 4. We have no time for people to go anywhere. Our intercollegiate athletic programs, for example. So we're trying to envision a whole new way for students to have many drop-in, drop-out opportunities to be engaged in a variety of ways on an international scale. I'll give you an example. One of the things that, and this is actually a Vanderbilt example, but at Vanderbilt, we had a great baseball team. Had our baseball team take a semester worth of course on Cuba, and then they went and played baseball in Cuba. We can do anything if we put our mind to it, and that's the whole point. We need to rethink this nation, the nature of international engagement, and come up with a number of different approaches. The final point is there's not one way to salvation. There are multiple ways, and so we'll figure it out. Great, thanks.
It is 4 o'clock, and we have this little party to go to in a few minutes, so we're going to bring this to a close. I want to thank all of you for coming out this afternoon and participating in this really historic event, and the culmination of President Dennison's 20 years here and the beginning of a new exciting era for the University of Montana and for higher education in general. Would you join me first in thanking our panelists? Peter and Gordon, I want to give a special thanks to you for taking the time out of your very hectic schedules to come here and be with us today. It meant a great deal to all of us, and I know it meant a great deal to George. Your enthusiastic response when we first contacted you was just so gratifying. So thank you both for being here.
Time I know I can speak for Gordon as well to be here. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Would you join me in giving a round of appreciation to the staff folks in the Office of the President and the Office of the Provost and here in the Montana Theater for their work behind the scenes. And finally, George, if I could ask you to stand, let's give George Dennison one last round of applause here. Okay, we'll see you all at the reception. Thank you.